The autumn rain hammered Cincinnati's concrete sidewalks with relentless fury, each drop creating tiny explosions that mirrored the chaos in 8-year-old Tommy Sullivan's heart. Outside Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center, the boy sat hunched on the cold steps, his thin shoulders shaking not just from the October chill, but from the weight of a reality too heavy for his young mind to bear. His father, Michael Sullivan, lay 3 floors above in the intensive care unit, connected to machines that beeped and hummed in a mechanical symphony that had become Tommy's nightmare soundtrack. The construction accident had happened so suddenly. One moment, his dad was high up on the scaffolding, joking with his crew about the Reds' playoff chances. And the next, he was falling through the air like a broken bird. Tommy's worn sneakers were soaked through, but he couldn't bring himself to go inside. The hospital's fluorescent lights felt too bright, too harsh, casting everything in an unforgiving white glow that made his father look like a stranger. The doctors used words Tommy didn't understand. Traumatic brain injury, induced coma, uncertain prognosis. But he understood the looks on their faces, the way they glanced at each other when they thought he wasn't watching. His mother, Sarah, had been at his father's bedside for 18 hours straight, holding Michael's lifeless hand and whispering prayers that seemed to disappear into the sterile hospital air. She'd forgotten to eat, forgotten to sleep, forgotten that her 8-year-old son needed her too. Tommy understood, though. He was scared too, so scared that his stomach felt like it was full of ice cubes that never melted. The rain grew heavier, and Tommy pulled his Cincinnati Reds jacket tighter around his small frame. It was his father's jacket, actually, too big for him, but it smelled like sawdust and aftershave, like Saturday mornings when they'd sit together watching baseball on their old television, his father explaining the intricacies of the game with the passion of a true believer. "Bottom of the 9th, 2 outs, bases loaded," his father would say, his eyes lighting up as he described his favorite scenarios. "That's when heroes are made, Tommy. When everything's on the line, and one swing of the bat can change everything." Now Tommy wondered if heroes were real, or if they only existed in baseball games and bedtime stories. He wondered if his father would ever wake up to tell him about baseball again, or if those memories were all he'd have left. A hospital security guard had asked him to move twice, but Tommy had just stared at him with eyes so full of pain that the man's stern expression had softened, and he'd walked away without another word. There was something about the boy's stillness, his quiet acceptance of misery, that made grown-ups uncomfortable. It was as if Tommy had aged years in the past 3 days, his childhood dissolving like sugar in the rain. Cars passed by on the busy street, their headlights creating streaks of light through the downpour. People hurried past with umbrellas and raincoats, everyone rushing somewhere important, everyone with places to be and people who needed them. Tommy envied them their certainty, their purposeful movement through the world. The hospital doors opened and closed with a whoosh of warm air, bringing the sounds of the medical world. Announcements over intercom systems, the squeak of wheels on linoleum, hushed conversations between doctors and nurses. Each time someone emerged, Tommy looked up hopefully, thinking maybe it would be his mother with good news, with the miracle they'd been praying for. But the faces that appeared were always strangers, people dealing with their own crises, their own fears. Cincinnati was a city full of working families like the Sullivans, people who built things with their hands and loved their baseball team with religious devotion. The hospital served them all, the construction workers, the factory employees, the small business owners who formed the backbone of the community. Tommy's fingers were getting numb from the cold, but still he sat there, a small sentinel keeping watch over his family's tragedy. He'd overheard his Aunt Linda on the phone earlier, talking in hushed tones about funeral arrangements and insurance policies. The adults thought he didn't understand, but Tommy was a smart kid. He knew that sometimes people went to sleep in hospitals and never woke up, The rain began to ease slightly, though the grey clouds hanging low over the city suggested it was just a brief respite. Tommy wiped his nose on his sleeve and tried to remember the last thing his father had said to him. It was that morning before leaving for work. Michael had ruffled his son's hair and said, "Be good for your mum, slugger. We'll throw the ball around when I get home." The baseball sat at home on Tommy's dresser, a scuffed leather sphere that held 1,000 memories of evenings in the backyard, his father's patient voice teaching him how to hold his glove, how to keep his eye on the ball, how to believe in himself, even when the odds were stacked against him. "Baseball's like life, Tommy," his father had told him just last week. "Sometimes you strike out, sometimes you hit a home run, but you never stop swinging, you never give up. That's what separates the winners from the quitters." Now Tommy wondered if his father was giving up. If somewhere in that place between sleeping and waking, Michael Sullivan was deciding whether to keep fighting or let go. The thought made Tommy's chest tight with panic, and fresh tears mixed with the rain on his cheeks. The hospital steps were starting to feel like home in a terrible way. He'd been coming here every day since the accident, sitting in waiting rooms that smelled like disinfectant and sadness, watching his mother transform from the woman who sang while making breakfast into a hollow-eyed stranger who jumped at every sound. As the afternoon wore on, the traffic on the street began to thin. The workday was ending for most people, but for the Sullivan family, time had stopped 3 days ago at 2:47 p.m. when the call came to Tommy's school office and changed everything forever. Tommy closed his eyes and tried to pray the way his mother had taught him, but the words felt empty and small against the enormity of what they were facing. He prayed for his father to wake up, for his mother to smile again, for life to go back to the way it was before. But God felt very far away, somewhere beyond the grey clouds and the indifferent rain. The boy's stomach growled, reminding him that he'd barely eaten since the accident. Food seemed wrong somehow, like a betrayal of the seriousness of the situation. His mother had forgotten to pack him lunch for school, and he'd been too embarrassed to tell his teacher, so he'd gone hungry, his empty stomach echoing the emptiness in his heart. An ambulance pulled up to the emergency room entrance, its red lights cutting through the grey afternoon like urgent prayers. Tommy watched as paramedics rushed someone inside, and he wondered if that family was just beginning their own nightmare, just starting their own vigil in the land of beeping machines and uncomfortable chairs. The rain stopped completely now, leaving the world washed and gleaming. But Tommy felt no cleaner for it. His grief clung to him like mud, heavy and dark and impossible to shake off. He pulled his father's jacket tighter and prepared for another long night of waiting, another stretch of hours where every minute felt like an eternity. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of the city carrying on without them. Traffic, construction, life continuing its relentless march forward. But for Tommy Sullivan, time had become something different, something stretched and painful, marked not by clocks, but by the rhythm of machines keeping his father alive. The hospital doors opened again, and this time his mother appeared, her face drawn and pale, her clothes wrinkled from sleeping in a chair. She looked around until she spotted Tommy, and for a moment, her expression softened with something like relief. "Tommy, honey, you can't keep sitting out here," she said, her voice hoarse from crying and worry. "It's getting cold." "Is Dad awake?" Tommy asked, even though he could see the answer in her eyes. Sarah Sullivan knelt down beside her son, her own jacket soaked from the earlier rain. She pulled him close, and for a moment they were just a mother and child holding each other against the storm. Two people trying to be brave in a world that had suddenly become very scary. "Not yet, baby," she whispered into his hair. "But we have to keep hoping. Your dad's the strongest man I know, and he's fighting to come back to us." Tommy wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the certainty in her voice, But doubt had taken root in his heart like weeds in untended soil. He'd seen the way the nurses looked at his mother with pity, the way the doctors measured their words carefully, as if speaking too directly might shatter what little hope remained. As they sat together on the hospital steps, watching the evening settle over Cincinnati like a heavy blanket, neither of them could have imagined that tomorrow would bring a chance encounter that would change everything. That a baseball legend walking past their family's darkest hour would become the catalyst for something extraordinary. But tonight, they were just two people learning to carry grief, two hearts trying to beat normally in a world that had tilted off its axis. And in the morning, when the sun rose over a city that never stopped believing in second chances, their story would take a turn that neither statistics nor medical textbooks could have predicted. The morning sun painted Cincinnati's streets in golden hues, a stark contrast to the grey despair that had settled over the Sullivan family like fog. Tommy had spent another restless night in the hospital's family sleeping area, his small body curled up in a chair that wasn't designed for comfort, dreams filled with the mechanical sounds of his father's life support systems. It was Tuesday, October 15th, and Tommy should have been in Mrs. Henderson's third-grade classroom, learning about multiplication tables and reading about adventures in distant lands. Instead, he was back on the hospital steps, his mother having convinced him to eat half a sandwich from the cafeteria before resuming his vigil in the cool morning air. The city was coming alive around him. Construction workers drove past in pickup trucks, their hard hats and lunchboxes visible through dirty windows, reminding Tommy painfully of his father's own morning routine. Office workers hurried by with coffee cups and briefcases, everyone moving with purpose, while Tommy felt suspended in time, caught between hope and despair. His mother was upstairs again, holding his father's hand and talking to him about everything and nothing, the weather, Tommy's school, memories from their 15-year marriage. The doctors had said that comatose patients might be able to hear, that familiar voices could sometimes reach through the darkness. Sarah clung to this possibility like a lifeline, her voice growing hoarse from hours of one-sided conversation. Tommy understood why she needed to be up there, but the hospital room felt like a tomb to him, all white walls and beeping machines and the terrible stillness of his father's face. Out here, he could at least pretend that life was still possible, that somewhere beyond the medical terminology and grim statistics, hope might still exist. A group of teenagers walked past, laughing about something that happened at school, their voices carrying the careless joy that Tommy felt he might never experience again. He watched them with a mixture of envy and confusion. How could the world contain so much happiness when his family was drowning in sorrow? Cars continued their steady stream past the hospital, and Tommy found himself playing a game he'd invented to pass the time. He'd watch each vehicle approach and try to guess what kind of person was driving, what their story might be, whether they were happy or sad or worried about someone they loved. It was easier than thinking about his own story, easier than facing the questions that haunted his quiet moments. The morning wore on, and Tommy's stomach began to growl again. His mother had given him $5 for lunch, but the cafeteria food tasted like cardboard, and eating felt like a betrayal when his father couldn't even swallow. Still, he knew he should try to eat something, if only to keep his strength up for the long days ahead. He was just getting ready to venture inside when he noticed a man walking slowly down the sidewalk, moving with the careful gait of someone whose body had absorbed years of athletic punishment. The man was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of a lifetime spent squinting into stadium lights. He wore a simple jacket and jeans, nothing that would mark him as different from any other Cincinnati resident, but something about his bearing caught Tommy's attention. The man paused near the hospital entrance, reaching into his jacket pocket for what looked like a phone. As he did, Tommy caught sight of something that made his heart skip, A Cincinnati Reds pin on the man's jacket lapel, the kind that wasn't sold in gift shops, the kind that spoke of deeper connections to the team. Tommy had been a Reds fan his entire short life, raised on stories of the Big Red Machine and the glory days when Cincinnati was the heart of baseball. His father had season tickets when he was younger, before Tommy was born, and money got tighter, and the walls of their small house were covered with memorabilia from better times. The man finished his phone call and began walking again, but something made him slow down as he passed Tommy. Maybe it was the sight of a child sitting alone outside a hospital, or the way Tommy's oversized Reds jacket hung on his thin frame like a flag of loyalty in the face of defeat. "You okay there, son?" the man asked, his voice carrying a hint of the South, warm and concerned. Tommy looked up, and something in the man's eyes made him want to answer honestly. "My dad's in the hospital," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than any 8-year-old should have to bear. The man's expression softened, and he glanced up at the imposing facade of Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, and Tommy could tell he meant it. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" "Construction accident," Tommy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "He fell. The doctors say they don't know if he'll wake up." The man was quiet for a moment, and Tommy could see something shifting in his expression, some internal calculation of pain and possibility. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy Sullivan." "Well, Tommy Sullivan, my name is Pete." The man extended his hand, and Tommy shook it, surprised by the firmness of the grip and the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. Pete Rose. For a moment, the name didn't register. Tommy was so deep in his own grief that the words seemed to float past him without meaning. Then, like tumblers clicking into place in a lock, recognition dawned. Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle, the hit king, the man who'd played for the Cincinnati Reds during their greatest years, who'd embodied everything Tommy's father loved about baseball. The hustle, the determination, the refusal to give up no matter what the odds. Tommy's eyes widened, and for the first time in 3 days, something other than sadness flickered across his face. You're really Pete Rose." Pete smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "I am. And you're wearing my old team's colors with a lot of pride. I can see that." Tommy looked down at his father's jacket, suddenly conscious of how it hung on him like a tent. "It's my dad's," he said. "He loves the Reds. He always tells me stories about when you played, about the Big Red Machine, and how you never gave up no matter what." Something in Pete's eyes shifted at those words, a flicker of pain that Tommy was too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize. "Your dad sounds like a smart man," Pete said quietly, "and he's right about one thing. You never give up, not ever." The two of them stood there for a moment, an unlikely pair united by their love for a team and a game that had brought joy to countless summer afternoons. Cars continued to pass, people continued their hurried journeys, but in that small space outside the hospital, time seemed to slow down. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Rose?" Tommy said, his voice small but determined. "Of course, son. Do you think my dad's going to be okay?" Pete Rose had faced down plenty of tough questions in his life, from reporters, from commissioners, from his own conscience. But this question, asked by an 8-year-old boy whose world was crumbling, might have been the hardest one he'd ever confronted. He could have offered platitudes, empty reassurances that would mean nothing. Instead, he chose honesty, tempered with hope. "I don't know, Tommy," Pete said, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. "I wish I did, but I don't. What I do know is that your dad raised a son who sits outside a hospital wearing his team's colors, who doesn't give up on the people he loves. That tells me he's a fighter, just like you are." Tommy felt tears threatening again, but they felt different this time. Not the helpless tears of despair he'd been crying for days, but something cleaner. Something that might eventually lead to hope. "Would you Tommy began, then stopped, afraid to ask for too much from a man who'd already given him more attention than he'd received from anyone in days. "What is it, son? Would you come up and meet him? My dad, I mean, he's not awake, but my mum says maybe he can hear us. And it would mean everything to him to know you were there." Pete Rose looked up at the hospital building, its windows reflecting the morning sun like 1,000 watching eyes. He thought about his own father, who taught him to love baseball and work hard and never quit on anything that mattered. He thought about all the kids who'd asked him for autographs over the years, all the fathers who'd lifted their children onto their shoulders so they could see the hit king take his turn at bat. He thought about mistakes he'd made, bridges he'd burned, trust he'd broken. And he thought about redemption, about the possibility that sometimes the most important games weren't played in stadiums but in hospital rooms, weren't recorded in statistics but in the hearts of children who needed to believe in heroes. "Of course I will, Tommy," Pete said, standing up and adjusting his jacket. "Let's go see your dad." As they walked toward the hospital entrance together, Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in days, the sensation that maybe, just maybe, everything wasn't hopeless after all. Pete Rose was walking beside him, the man his father considered one of the greatest players who ever lived, and somehow that made the impossible seem a little more possible. The hospital doors opened with their familiar whoosh, and together they stepped into the bright fluorescent world of medicine and machines, carrying with them the hope that sometimes heroes show up exactly when they're needed most, wearing ordinary clothes and carrying extraordinary hearts. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt like ascending through layers of hope and fear, each floor marking a different stage of Tommy's emotional journey. Pete Rose stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back, his presence somehow making the sterile hospital environment feel less hostile, less final. Tommy's mother, Sarah, was exactly where he'd expected to find her, pulled up close to his father's bedside, her hand wrapped around Michael's motionless fingers, her voice soft and steady as she read from a sports magazine she'd picked up in the gift shop. "The Reds are looking good for next season," she was saying, her tone artificially bright. "New pitching coach, some promising rookies coming up from the minors. You'll want to get those season tickets again when you're better, Mike. Tommy's old enough now to really appreciate a full game." She looked up when she heard footsteps, expecting to see Tommy returning with maybe a nurse or doctor. Instead, she saw her son walking beside a man she didn't immediately recognize, though something about him struck her as familiar. "Mom," Tommy said, his voice carrying an excitement that hadn't been there in days. "This is Pete Rose. He wants to meet Dad." Sarah's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. She'd heard that name thousands of times in their house, had watched her husband's face light up whenever Pete Rose highlights came on television, had listened to Michael tell Tommy stories about Charlie Hustle and the Big Red Machine until she could recite them herself. "Oh my God," she whispered, standing up so quickly that her chair scraped against the linoleum floor. You're actually Pete Rose." Pete stepped forward, removing his jacket and hanging it carefully on the back of a chair. "Yes, ma'am. Your son told me about your husband, about what happened. I hope you don't mind me being here." "Mind?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "Mike would be beside himself. You're his hero. Tommy's too. He's got your rookie card in a frame on his bedroom wall." Pete looked over at the man in the hospital bed, taking in the tubes and wires, the mechanical ventilator that breathed for him, the monitors that tracked every function of his struggling body. Michael Sullivan looked young, maybe mid-30s, with work-roughened hands and the solid build of a man who made his living with physical labor. "He looks like a fighter," Pete said quietly, moving closer to the bed. "What can you tell me about him?" Sarah wiped her eyes with a tissue that had seen too much use over the past 3 days. He's the best man I know. Works construction. Been doing it since high school. Never missed a day unless he was really sick, and even then he'd try to go in." He loves Tommy more than anything in the world, loves baseball almost as much. He teaches me how to bat, Tommy added, moving to the opposite side of the bed from his mother. He says I've got a natural swing, that maybe someday I could play for the Reds like you did. Pete pulled up a chair and sat down beside the bed, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. What's he like when he's not working? He coaches Tommy's little league team, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she talked about the man she'd married. The West Side Pirates. They're not very good, lose more games than they win, but Mike always says it's not about winning, it's about learning to work together, learning to get back up when you fail. Sounds like a man who understands baseball, Pete said, reaching out to touch Michael's arm gently. And life. Tommy watched as Pete Rose, the man he'd heard about in countless bedtime stories, the player his father referred to as the embodiment of everything good about baseball, sat beside his father's bed like an old friend. It seemed impossible, like something from a dream, but the monitors continued their steady beeping, and the reality of the moment settled over him like a warm blanket. "Can I tell you what happened?" Sarah asked suddenly, as if she needed to share the story with someone who might understand the magnitude of what they'd lost. Pete nodded, settling back in his chair. "Please." "It was just a regular Tuesday morning," Sarah began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd replayed the events countless times in her mind. Mike was working on a new office building downtown, 10 stories up. He'd been doing high work for years, never had so much as a close call, but there was a problem with the scaffolding, some kind of structural failure. She paused, gathering herself, while Tommy moved closer to his father's bedside. He fell 4 stories onto a concrete pad. The other workers said he tried to grab onto something, tried to save himself, but there was nothing there. Her voice broke slightly. They said he was conscious when the ambulance arrived, kept asking about Tommy, about whether someone was going to pick him up from school. Pete felt something tighten in his chest. He thought about all the times he'd been injured on the field, all the times he'd gotten back up and kept playing because that's what you did, that's how the game worked. But life wasn't a game, and some injuries couldn't be healed with ice packs and determination. "The doctors say there's brain swelling," Sarah continued. "They put him in an induced coma to give his brain time to heal, but they don't know if he'll wake up. And if he does..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Tommy reached out and took his father's other hand, the one not being held by his mother. "Dad always says you never gave up, not even when you were down in the count. He says that's what made you great." Oh, Pete looked at this 8-year-old boy, trying to apply baseball lessons to a situation that had no rules, no clear way to win or lose. "Your dad's right about that," he said carefully. "I never did give up. But you know what made me never give up?" Tommy looked up with eyes that were desperate for any wisdom, any insight that might help him understand how to navigate this impossible situation. "It was knowing that people were counting on me," Pete continued. "My teammates, the fans, people like your dad who believed that effort mattered, that trying your hardest was more important than the final score." He leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to the intimate tone reserved for the most important conversations. "Right now, your dad is in the biggest game of his life, and he's got the best teammates he could ask for, you and your mum. He knows you're here, he knows you're fighting for him, and that's going to make all the difference." Sarah felt tears starting again, but they were different now. Not the desperate tears of helplessness, but something that might eventually become gratitude. Here was Pete Rose, a man her husband idolized, talking to their family like they mattered, like their struggle had meaning. "Mr. Rose," Tommy said quietly, "will you tell my dad one of your stories? He always tells me about the time you dove headfirst into home plate in the All-Star game, how you played like every game was the World Series." Pete smiled at the memory, though it was tinged with the complexity of his later years. "That was 1970, he said, settling back in his chair. July 14th, All-Star game at Riverfront Stadium, right here in Cincinnati. As he began to tell the story, his voice took on the rhythm of a natural storyteller, painting pictures with words of a different time, when baseball was simpler and heroes weren't as complicated. Tommy listened with rapt attention, while Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in days, caught up in the tale of a young player who refused to take anything for granted. Bottom of the 12th inning, Pete continued, his eyes distant with memory. Charlie Gehringer singles to center. I'm running from second base, and Ray Fosse is blocking the plate. Now, I could have slid feet first, played it safe, but that's not who I was. I dove head first, and we collided so hard that they heard it in the upper deck. Did it hurt? Tommy asked, leaning forward. Son, it hurt so bad I thought I might have broken every bone in my body, Pete laughed. But we won the game, and sometimes that's what matters most. Not whether it hurts, but whether you're willing to do whatever it takes for your team. He looked over at Michael Sullivan, still and quiet in his hospital bed, fighting a battle that couldn't be won with determination alone, but might be helped by the love surrounding him. Your dad's doing that right now, Pete said softly. He's fighting for his team, you and your mom. And the thing about fighters is they never know when to quit. They keep swinging until the final out, keep believing until the last possible second. The room fell quiet, except for the steady rhythm of the machines. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of despair, but the pause before possibility. Outside, Cincinnati continued its daily business, unaware that in one hospital room, a legend was helping a family remember how to hope. Tommy looked at his father's face, searching for any sign of change, any indication that Pete Rose's presence might be working some kind of miracle. The monitors continued their steady beeping, unchanged but somehow more reassuring now. Like a team that was holding its ground, refusing to give up the fight. Thank you, Sarah said suddenly, her voice thick with emotion. You didn't have to do this, but you did. And I'll never forget it. New Pete Rose stood up slowly, his knees protesting the movement with the accumulated aches of a lifetime in baseball. Mrs. Sullivan, there's nowhere else I'd rather be right now. Your husband and your son remind me why I loved this game in the first place. Because it teaches us that every day is a new chance to do something important. As he prepared to leave, Pete turned back to Tommy one more time. You keep wearing that jacket with pride, son. And you keep believing in your dad, because I can tell you from experience, the best players always save their greatest performances for when the stakes are highest. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but the impact of his visit lingered in the room like the echo of a perfectly struck ball. For the first time since the accident, the Sullivan family had been reminded that they weren't alone in their fight, that sometimes heroes showed up in the most unexpected places, carrying exactly the message that needed to be heard. 3 days had passed since Pete Rose's visit, and the memory of that afternoon had become a lifeline for the Sullivan family. Sarah had called her sister Linda to tell her about the encounter, her voice carrying a note of wonder that had been absent since the accident. Tommy had returned to school for half days, carrying with him a secret that made him feel connected to something larger than his family's tragedy. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic about Michael's latest tests. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the neurologist overseeing his care, had explained to Sarah that the swelling in his brain had begun to decrease, and they were going to try reducing his sedation to see if he might begin to show signs of consciousness. I want you to understand, Dr. Martinez had said in her careful professional way, that even if he does wake up, we don't know what his cognitive function will be like. Brain injuries are unpredictable, and recovery can take months or even years. But Sarah had heard the word recovery and held onto it like a rope thrown to a drowning person. For the first time since the accident, the possibility of a future seemed real, even if that future looked different from the one they'd planned. On Friday morning, October 18th, Sarah was sitting in her usual chair beside Michael's bed, reading him the sports section from the Cincinnati Enquirer. The Reds were already planning for next season, and she found herself genuinely interested in the trades and signings being discussed, imagining conversations she and Michael might have about the team's prospects. Tommy was in school, taking a math test that seemed trivial compared to the real-world calculations his family had been forced to make over the past week. The probability of recovery, the cost of extended care, the algebra of hope and despair that defined their new normal. The new shortstop they signed from the Tigers looks promising, Sarah was saying, her voice conversational, as if Michael might respond at any moment. 26 years old, good defensive statistics, and he hit .285 last season. You'd probably like him. She'd been talking to him like this for hours each day, following the advice of the nursing staff who insisted that familiar voices might help draw him back to consciousness. Sometimes she read from books, sometimes she told him about Tommy's school activities, and sometimes she just talked about whatever came to mind, filling the silence with the sound of life continuing. Around 10:30, she noticed something different. Michael's eyelids seemed to flutter slightly, and his hand, the one she'd been holding almost constantly for a week, seemed to move just barely, like someone testing the weight of a baseball bat for the first time. "Mike," she said softly, leaning forward in her chair. "Mike, can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing happened, and Sarah wondered if she'd imagined the movement, if hope had finally started playing tricks on her vision. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Michael's eyes began to open. They were unfocused at first, blinking against the fluorescent lights that must have seemed harsh after days of darkness. His mouth moved slightly, but no sound came out. The ventilator was still breathing for him, making speech impossible. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed the call button for the nurses. "He's waking up," she said to the intercom, her voice shaking with excitement and terror. "My husband is waking up." Dr. Martinez arrived within minutes, followed by 2 nurses who began checking Michael's vital signs and responses. They shined lights in his eyes, tested his reflexes, asked him to squeeze their hands if he could understand them. Michael's responses were weak but unmistakable. He was fighting his way back to consciousness. "Mr. Sullivan," Dr. Martinez said clearly, "I'm Dr. Martinez, your neurologist. You've been in an accident and you're in the hospital. You're safe and your family is here with you." Michael's eyes found Sarah's face, and she saw recognition there. Not complete understanding, perhaps, but the fundamental knowledge that she was someone important, someone who belonged in his world. The process of removing the ventilator took another hour, a careful procedure that would allow Michael to breathe on his own if his body was ready. Sarah called Tommy's school and asked them to bring him to the hospital immediately, her voice barely able to convey the magnitude of what was happening. When the tube was finally removed, Michael's first word was barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. "Tommy," he said, his voice rough from disuse but unmistakably his own. Tommy arrived 30 minutes later, still wearing his school backpack, his face flushed from running through the hospital corridors. When he saw his father's eyes open, looking at him with genuine recognition, the 8-year-old boy did something he hadn't done since he was much younger. He threw himself into his father's arms and cried. "Dad, you're okay," Tommy sobbed against his father's chest. "I was so scared, but Pete Rose came to see you, and he said you were a fighter, and he was right." Michael's arms moved slowly to embrace his son, the movement careful and deliberate, as if he was relearning how his body worked. "Pete Rose?" he whispered, confusion evident in his voice. Sarah moved closer to the bed, her hand finding Michael's free arm. "He came to visit you while you were unconscious. Tommy met him outside the hospital and he came up to see you. He said you were fighting the biggest game of your life." Michael's eyes widened slightly, and Sarah could see him trying to process this information. "The Pete Rose? Here?" Tommy pulled back to look at his father, his face shining with joy and residual tears. "Yes, Dad. The real Pete Rose. He said you raised a son who never gives up on the people he loves, and that made you a fighter too." Michael tried to smile, the expression weak but genuine. Did you tell him I named you after Tommy Helms?" "No," Tommy laughed through his tears, "but I told him about all the stories you tell me, about the big red machine, and how you never give up, no matter what." Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her clipboard in hand, but her professional demeanor softened by the obvious joy in the room. "Mr. Sullivan, I need to run some tests to assess your cognitive function, but what I'm seeing so far is very encouraging. You're responding appropriately to questions, you recognize your family, and your motor functions appear to be intact." Over the next several hours, a parade of medical professionals came and went, each one adding to the growing picture of Michael's condition. The tests revealed what Dr. Martinez called remarkably positive results. While there would likely be some short-term memory issues and a need for physical therapy to regain his full strength, the fundamental Michael Sullivan was intact. As the afternoon wore on, Michael's voice grew stronger and his questions became more complex. He wanted to know how long he'd been unconscious, what had happened to his construction crew, whether his family had been okay financially during his absence. Each question felt like a small miracle to Sarah, proof that her husband's mind was working, planning, caring about the people and responsibilities that had always defined him. "The guys from work have been incredible," Sarah told him, adjusting his pillows so he could sit up more comfortably. "They've been taking turns checking on us, bringing dinner, making sure we're okay. Your foreman, Joe, says your job will be waiting when you're ready to come back." Michael nodded slowly, then turned to Tommy. "And school? You've been going to school?" "Most days," Tommy admitted, "but I kept coming here to sit outside and wait for you to wake up. That's how I met Pete Rose. He was walking by and saw me crying on the steps." "Tell me about it," Michael said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Tell me everything." So Tommy did. He told his father about the rain and the fear, about feeling like God was too far away to hear his prayers, about how Pete Rose had stopped and asked if he was okay. He described the conversation outside the hospital, the way Pete had looked at him with genuine concern, the moment when recognition had dawned. "He said I was wearing the team's colors with a lot of pride," Tommy continued, pulling at his father's oversized Reds jacket. "And when I told him about you, about how you taught me that you never give up, his whole face changed, like he understood something important." Michael listened with the intensity he usually reserved for close baseball games, his eyes never leaving his son's face. "What did he say when you asked him to come see me?" "He didn't hesitate," Tommy said proudly. "He just said, 'Of course I will, Tommy,' and walked right into the hospital with me. Mom was reading you sports scores when we got to the room." Sarah picked up the story, describing Pete's quiet presence beside the bed, the way he'd talked to Michael as if he were an old friend, the stories he'd told about playing with intensity and never giving up. "He said you were in the biggest game of your life and that you had the best teammates you could ask for. Me and Tommy. He told me about the 1970 All-Star game," Tommy added excitedly, "about diving headfirst into home plate and colliding with Ray Fosse. He said sometimes it doesn't matter if it hurts, as long as you're willing to do whatever it takes for your team." Michael was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had happened during his absence from consciousness. Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle himself, had sat beside his bed, had comforted his family, had shared the wisdom that had made him a legend. "I can't believe it," Michael finally said, his voice filled with wonder. "Pete Rose came to see me." "He left something for you," Sarah said suddenly, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a baseball, obviously well used but carefully maintained, its leather surface bearing the patina of age and handling. He signed it before he left. She handed the ball to Michael, who turned it slowly in his hands until he found the signature. In Pete's distinctive handwriting were the words, "To Michael Sullivan, keep fighting the good fight. Your family believes in you. Pete Rose." Michael stared at the baseball for a long time, his thumb tracing over the signature. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "This is the greatest gift anyone's ever given me," he said quietly. "Not just the baseball, but what he did for you two while I couldn't be there for you." Tommy climbed carefully onto the bed beside his father, mindful of the various tubes and wires still connected to the monitors. "Dad, were you dreaming while you were asleep? Could you hear us talking to you?" Michael considered the question seriously. "I don't remember specific dreams, but I remember feeling surrounded by love. Like I was floating in warm water and I could hear voices calling me back to shore. Your voice, Mom's voice, and sometimes other voices that seemed familiar but distant." "Maybe you heard Pete Rose," Tommy suggested hopefully. "Maybe I did," Michael agreed, pulling his son closer. "Maybe that's what gave me the strength to swim back." Dr. Martinez returned in the early evening with Michael's latest test results and a treatment plan that included several more days in the hospital, followed by outpatient physical therapy and cognitive rehabilitation. The prognosis was better than anyone had dared to hope. While recovery would take time, there was every reason to believe that Michael would return to his normal life with minimal lasting effects. "I have to ask, Doctor," Martinez said with a slight smile, "did Pete Rose really visit you while you were unconscious?" "He did," Sarah confirmed. "It was the most incredible thing. He just happened to be walking by when Tommy was outside, and he took the time to care about a complete stranger's family." "Well," Dr. Martinez said, making notes on her chart, "I don't know if it was the medical treatment or the therapeutic value of having a baseball legend in your corner, but your recovery is remarkable. You should be very proud of how you've all handled this ordeal." As evening settled over Cincinnati, the Sullivan family found themselves together in a way they hadn't been since before the accident. Michael was tired but alert, asking questions about everything that had happened during his week of unconsciousness. Tommy had called his teacher to report that his father was awake, and she'd promised to tell the whole class, who had been worried about him. The baseball sat on Michael's bedside table, a tangible reminder that sometimes extraordinary things happen to ordinary people, that heroes could appear when they were needed most, and that the values taught by America's pastime, perseverance, teamwork, never giving up, had real meaning beyond the diamond. "Dad," Tommy said as visiting hours were drawing to a close, "when you get better, can we go to a Reds game? All of us together?" Michael squeezed his son's hand, feeling strength returning to his grip with each passing hour. "Son, we're going to go to so many Reds games that you'll get tired of hot dogs and peanuts, and we're going to cheer so loud that they'll hear us in the cheap seats." Sarah smiled, watching her husband and son make plans for a future that had seemed impossible just days before. Outside the hospital windows, Cincinnati sparkled with lights, a city full of working families and baseball fans, and people who understood that sometimes the most important victories happened far from any stadium. The monitors continued their steady beeping, but now they sounded like applause, like the rhythm of a crowd clapping for a player who had given everything he had and found a way to come through when it mattered most. Michael Sullivan had won the biggest game of his life, and his family had learned that heroes came in many forms, some wearing uniforms, some wearing ordinary clothes and extraordinary hearts. 6 months later, on a warm April evening that carried the promise of summer, Michael Sullivan stood in the backyard of their small Cincinnati home, throwing batting practice to his son, Tommy. The physical therapy had been successful beyond all expectations. His coordination was back to normal, his strength had returned, and the only lasting reminder of the accident was a small scar on his forehead that he wore with pride, like a badge of survival. Tommy had grown taller over the winter, filling out his father's old Reds jacket in a way that made it look less like a hand-me-down and more like it had been tailored for him. His swing had improved dramatically, and Michael could see the natural ability that Pete Rose had somehow recognized during a few minutes of conversation outside a hospital. "Keep your eye on the ball, slugger," Michael called out, lobbing an easy pitch toward home plate, a cardboard box they'd set up in the grass. "Remember what we talked about. See it all the way to the bat." Tommy connected solidly, sending the ball arcing over the neighbor's fence for what would have been a home run in any Little League park. He dropped the bat and jogged around the bases they'd marked with old towels, his arms raised in triumph. "Did you see that, Dad? Did you see how far it went?" Michael grinned, bending down to retrieve another ball from the bucket beside him. "I saw it, and I'm pretty sure Mrs. Patterson is going to need a new garden gnome. You've got power, son, real power." The Westside Pirates had won their first 3 games of the season, with Tommy batting cleanup and playing shortstop with the confidence of someone who'd learned that the most important games weren't always played on fields. Michael had returned to coaching the team in March, and the other parents had welcomed him back with a warmth that spoke to the tight-knit nature of their community. Sarah appeared in the back doorway, holding a cordless phone and wearing an expression that Michael had learned to recognize over their 16 years of marriage. Excitement mixed with disbelief. "Mike," she called out, "you need to take this call." "Who is it?" he asked, jogging over to where she stood. "Just take it," she said, pressing the phone into his hands with a smile that suggested she knew something he didn't. Michael put the phone to his ear, still catching his breath from the impromptu batting practice. "Hello? Is this Michael Sullivan?" The voice was familiar, though Michael couldn't immediately place it. "Yes, this is Mike Sullivan." "Mike, this is Pete Rose." Michael felt the world shift slightly, the way it had when he'd first regained consciousness in the hospital. "Mr. Rose, how did you get my number?" Pete's laugh carried the same warmth that Tommy had described from their first meeting. "I called the hospital and asked them to help me track you down. I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to check in, see how you were doing." "I'm doing great," Michael said, sitting down heavily on the back steps. "Better than great, actually. The doctors say I've made a complete recovery. I'm back to work, back to coaching my son's baseball team. Life is good." "I'm glad to hear that, Mike. Really glad. Your family went through hell, and I've been thinking about you all, wondering how things turned out." Tommy had wandered over, curious about the phone call that had made his father sit down so suddenly. When Michael mouthed Pete Rose, Tommy's eyes went wide, and he moved closer, trying to hear both sides of the conversation. "Mr. Rose," Michael said, "I can never thank you enough for what you did for my family. Tommy told me about how you found him outside the hospital, how you came up to see me when I was unconscious. Sarah says you told them stories, gave them hope when they didn't have any left." "That boy of yours is something special," Pete replied. "The way he sat there in the rain wearing your jacket, refusing to give up on you, that took real character. You should be proud of the son you're raising." Michael looked at Tommy, who was practically vibrating with excitement beside him. "I am proud of him. Every day. Listen, would it be possible? Would you be interested in meeting Tommy again? Under better circumstances this time?" "Funny you should ask," Pete said, and Michael could hear the smile in his voice. "I'm going to be signing autographs at the baseball grounds of Jacksonville next Saturday afternoon. It's a minor league park, but they're having a special event for kids and families. Would you and Tommy like to come? Bring Sarah too, of course." Michael covered the phone with his hand and looked at his son. "Tommy, how would you like to see Pete Rose again? He's going to be signing autographs next Saturday." Tommy's response was immediate and emphatic. "Yes, oh man, yes, can we really go?" "We'll be there," Michael told Pete. "Thank you for thinking of us." "Mike, before you go, can I ask you something?" "Of course. How's Tommy's baseball coming along? I remember he had a good stance when I saw him. Looked like he had natural ability. Michael glanced at the baseball that was still sitting where it had landed after Tommy's last home run. He's gotten a lot better. Made the All-Star team this year, and his coach thinks he might have a real future in the game. I'd like to see him play sometime, if that would be all right with you. Mr. Rose, you're welcome at any of our games, anytime. The kids would go crazy if you showed up. They made arrangements to meet at the ballpark the following Saturday, and as Michael hung up the phone, he realized that the circle that had begun with a construction accident and a crying boy on hospital steps was somehow completing itself in the most unexpected way. Saturday arrived with perfect baseball weather, sunny and warm, with a light breeze that carried the smell of fresh-cut grass and concession stand hot dogs. The baseball grounds of Jacksonville was smaller than Riverfront Stadium, but it had the classic charm of a minor league park, with green walls and advertisements for local businesses. Tommy had been awake since dawn, too excited to sleep, changing clothes 3 times before settling on his best jeans and a Cincinnati Reds jersey that Sarah had bought him for the occasion. He carried the signed baseball that Pete had left at the hospital, wrapped carefully in a towel to protect it during the drive. When they arrived at the park, there was already a line of families waiting for the autograph session. Kids of all ages wore baseball jerseys and carried gloves, balls, and programs, their faces bright with the particular excitement that came from meeting a hero. Pete Rose was set up at a table near the pitcher's mound, wearing a casual shirt and jeans, looking relaxed and happy as he signed baseballs and posed for pictures. When he saw the Sullivan family approaching, he stood up and walked over to greet them personally. "Tommy!" he called out, extending his hand for the elaborate handshake they'd developed during their brief but memorable friendship. "Look at you! You've grown at least 6 inches since I saw you last." "Mr. Rose," Tommy said, his voice filled with awe despite having met Pete before. "Thank you for inviting us. This is the best day ever." Pete turned to Michael and Sarah, shaking their hands warmly. "You both look great," he said sincerely. "Mike, you look like a man who's been given a second chance and knows what to do with it." "I feel like that," Michael replied. "Every morning when I wake up, I remember how close we came to losing everything, and I don't take any of it for granted anymore." Pete spent the next hour with the Sullivan family, signing multiple items for Tommy, taking pictures and asking detailed questions about the boys' baseball progress. When Tommy mentioned that he'd made the All-Star team, Pete's face lit up with genuine pride. "That's fantastic, son. What position are you playing?" "Shortstop mostly, but coach says I might try pitching too." "Shortstop's a thinking man's position," Pete said approvingly. "You've got to see the whole field, anticipate what might happen. It's perfect for a smart kid like you." As the afternoon wore on, Pete asked if they'd like to stay for the minor league game that was starting in a few hours. "I've got box seats behind home plate," he said. "We could watch some baseball together, and I could tell you more stories about the old days." Sekizim. They spent the evening watching the Jacksonville Jumbo Shrimp play the Birmingham Barons, Pete providing running commentary about the players, the strategies, and the subtle aspects of the game that most fans never noticed. Tommy absorbed every word like a sponge, asking questions that demonstrated a deep understanding of baseball that went far beyond his years. "Your boy's got a real feel for the game," Pete told Michael during the 7th inning stretch. "I can see it in the questions he asks, the way he watches the players position themselves. That's not something you can teach. It's instinctive." "He gets that from you," Sarah said to her husband. "All those hours in the backyard, all those games you've watched together." Michael put his arm around his son, who was keeping careful score of the game in a notebook Pete had given him. "I just teach him the basics. The love of the game, that comes from somewhere else." As the game ended and they prepared to leave, Pete pulled Tommy aside for a private conversation. "I want you to promise me something," he said, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. "Anything, Mr. Rose. I want you to promise me that you'll remember this feeling, The feeling of loving something so much that you'd do anything to be good at it. Baseball is a great game, but it's not the only game. Whatever you decide to do with your life, I want you to play it like you mean it, like every at-bat matters. Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding that this was about more than baseball, more than the minor league game they just watched together. And I want you to remember that heroes aren't just people who hit home runs or win championships, Pete continued. Sometimes heroes are construction workers who get up every morning to provide for their families. Sometimes heroes are 8-year-old boys who sit in the rain waiting for their fathers to wake up. Sometimes heroes are mothers who hold everything together when the world falls apart. Tommy looked back at his parents, who were watching the conversation with expressions of gratitude and amazement. "I'll remember," Tommy promised. Pete stood up and handed Tommy a final gift, a brand new baseball, unsigned and perfect. "This one's for playing," he said. "Not for keeping on a shelf, but for throwing and catching and hitting, because the best way to honor the game is to play it." As they walked to their car, Tommy between his parents, the Sullivan family carried with them something more valuable than autographs or memorabilia. They carried the knowledge that kindness could appear in the most unexpected places, that heroes came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important victories were measured not in runs scored, but in love shared. 6 months later, Tommy Sullivan would lead his Little League team to the championship game, playing shortstop with the confidence of someone who'd learned that the biggest games weren't always played in stadiums. Michael would be there cheering from the stands, grateful for every game, every moment, every chance to watch his son grow into the kind of person who understood that giving up was never an option. And somewhere in Cincinnati, whenever the Reds played and the crowd rose to its feet for a crucial moment, there would be people who remembered that baseball was about more than statistics and standings. It was about hope, perseverance, and the belief that heroes could appear exactly when they were needed most, carrying exactly the message that needed to be heard. The story had come full circle, from tears on hospital steps to cheers in baseball stadiums, from a family facing their darkest hour to a future bright with possibility. And at the center of it all was the simple truth that Pete Rose had recognized from the beginning, that the Sullivan family had everything they needed to win the most important game of all, the game of life, played with love, determination, and an unshakable belief in second chances.